Welcome to the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research virtually. My name is Alex Weiser. I'm the Director of Public Programs of YIVO, and we're really delighted to bring you this program about Fear and Other Stories by Chana Blankshteyn, newly translated by Anita Norich, for which we're also delighted to have Chana Kronfeld with us. Before we start, I want to say that we're delighted that this program is in collaboration with the Center for Jewish History, as well as the Yiddish Book Center. For those that don't know YIVO, just a very brief word about YIVO. We're a special place for the celebration and contemplation of Jewish history and Jewish culture. We have a library and archive with over 23 million documents and 400,000 books, which are used by researchers from around the world. We have a variety of public programs like this, as well as classes and exhibitions that bring to life this world of Jewish history and Jewish culture. We're really pleased to have with us Anita Norich and Chana Kronfeld. Anita Norich is Collegiate Professor Emerita of English and Judaic Studies at the University of Michigan. She's also the newly appointed academic advisor to the Center for Jewish History Fellowship Program. Chana Kronfeld is the Bernie H. Williams Professor of Modern Hebrew, Yiddish, and Comparative Literature at the Berkeley Center for Jewish Studies, where she teaches Hebrew, Yiddish, and comparative literature with a special emphasis on modern poetry. Both Anita and Chana are translators and really important scholarly writers about Jewish literature. The list of their published works is too long to go into right now, but you can read a bit about it on the webpage for this event. And suffice to say, if you're not familiar with their work, we urge you to check it out. And with that, I'm going to hand the conversation over to the two of them. Thank you both so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alex, and thank you, the YIVO. I want to start with with a much needed declaration of allegiance. I am a decades-long fan of Anita's work, and the dialogue between us has made me very happy over the years. I'm a huge fan of this particular book and translations, and I want to start by just reading the blurb. So in the interest of full disclosure, I blurbed the book. And if you buy it, which I hope you will, you'll see it on the back. So Anita Norich's vivid, nuanced translations and illuminating introduction offer an important recovery project, the work of a forgotten Yiddish woman modernist whose riveting stories explore the fracturing impact of historical crisis, World War I, the Russian Revolution and Civil War, the rise of Nazism, and its effect on everyday life. Life-affirming despite the horror, and you'll see that if you read it, especially in the first story, which reads like a really very tense, very dramatic thriller, but has this amazing life-affirming ending. So life-affirming despite the horror, she explores the sense of community in a Jewish urban courtyard in Vilnius. We're going to hear a little bit from that story later on. And collaborative Jewish work in a Paris fashion salon. In terse prose, we enter the thoughts of a Jewish woman mathematician, a medical researcher, and the revolutionary granddaughter of a Hasidic Rebbe. So everything but the usual stereotypes. So Anita, welcome, and let's get started.
Can I just get started before you get started by first of all thanking you? I mean, I have been a fan for as long as I think I've been able to read. And I also want to thank YIVO, the Center for Jewish History, and the Yiddish Book Center for sponsoring this. These are absolutely the most appropriate places to launch this book, since they're the only two places in the United States where this book can be found in Yiddish.
Exactly. So Anita, tell us a bit about Chana Blankshteyn and the publication history of this collection, which of course appears in English for the first time.
Biographical information on Blankshteyn is actually a little hard to come by. She lived from, I think 1860-ish to 1939. I'm only sure about the death date because I found I've forgotten the word, necrologen for her. Obituaries, that's the word. There's an essay about her, a really important essay by Ellie Kelman, and then there are some mentions of her by Polish scholars that also mention her in English, but it's really hard to get accurate biographical information on her. She was a woman who fought for women's rights. She fought for the poor. She was very active politically, first in the Volkspartei, and then in Polizian, in the Zionist organization. And she was very well educated. She had governesses and schools in France and in Germany. She was, like most Yiddish writers, multilingual and well-read in at least half a dozen languages. These two, if I could just say a word about these two copies of the book, because just the book history of this is so fascinating to me. I was looking, when I was on an NEH grant at the Center for Jewish History, I was looking for works for novels in particular by women, because they're said not to have written novels, which of course is nonsense. And I was looking for it by looking for first names of women, Chana, Sore, Rivke, just seeing what they wrote. And I saw this Chana Blankshteyn, whom I'd never heard of, and they were short stories, so I wasn't going to pay attention to them, except they were published in 1939 in Vilna with a short introduction by Max Weinreich. So this is obviously a woman who was important in her own day, who was very well known, and who I obviously think deserved to be better known.
So you mentioned briefly that there's this widespread belief, even among scholars, that women's contribution to Yiddish literature is limited to poetry. Of course, your translation projects in recent years disprove this myth. And I noticed that Jordan Finken is here. Hi, Jordan. And he and Alison Schechter collaborated this last year on a similar translation of women's prose by Fadl Stock. Tell us a little bit more about the reasons for this myth, and also maybe mention some of your other translation projects that have to do with that bridging of poetry and prose.
First of all, it's important to acknowledge that there have been more translations of women's prose in the last 15 years than in the 100 years before that. And in translating these women, I am in extraordinarily good company. You mentioned Alison and Jordan. Irena Klepfish has been a forerunner in this. Norma Fain Pratt, Frida Foreman. The problem of naming people is that you leave somebody out and then you've been insulting, and I really don't mean that. But more recently, Goldie Morgenthaler, Jessica Curzane, Ellen Cassidy, Faith Jones, some of whom, or all of whom, were on this webinar. My mantra for years now has been that it's not particularly profound. You don't go looking for something when you think you know what's there. I mean, why go looking if it's all clear? And we thought we knew. Generations of Yiddish students and Yiddish scholars were given must-read Yiddish lists. You have to read these 100 works with not a single woman on them. That was certainly my experience. It's certainly not a single woman prose writer on them. And that just didn't make sense to me, that they didn't write these works. So I began by translating a novel by Kaja Molodowski, who actually wrote 4 novels that have been largely ignored, unlike her poetry. What?
It's totally amazing. It's just really
4 novels.
Yeah.
4 novels. Yeah. 2 of them serialized. 1 of them, I think, unfinished, but 4 novels. Then I did this collection of short stories, which, as I said, I wasn't planning to do at all until I started reading. and a couple of scattered stories, short stories written before 1910, which is when modernism is set to begin. And I wanted to see what happened earlier. I'm now finishing a translation of a novel by Celia Dropkin, another great poet, called Die Zwei Gefühle, Two Feelings, which was serialized in the Vorwärts in 1934 and disappeared from most consciousness afterwards. Then I actually have a next project, and I see Ellen Cassidy is here. This is the first time I'm doing a collaborative translation with Ellen Cassidy, who's a terrific translator. And we're going to translate a novel, a roman à clé, about the Jungian, about the New York poetry group, The Youth, a novel that was written by Rachel Vaprinsky, another person known as a great poet,
Right.
But who also wrote novels. So, I'm having a good time with all of this. And as I say, I'm part of a growing and really wonderful community of translators.
So you think that the reason she became so unknown in English and even forgotten from in the annals of Yiddish literary history is because she wasn't also known as a poet?
No.
Why is she so forgotten? Is there, in other words, my hypothesis is always that there's something that must be forgotten about what she does.
Something must be forgotten. Well, I think the answer to that is sort of painfully clear. The book was published in July of 1939 in Vilna. Not a propitious moment to launch a book. The stories had been published serially not serially, they had been published individually in Vilna newspapers. Most of them had. But this was put together by a group of her friends who knew that she was dying. She had, I say this in the introduction a little painfully, she had the good fortune to die before the war started, weeks later. So there's history that can explain it. I mean, the history of the Second World War. And there is the inescapable fact that women's prose was simply ignored. So she just fell between I don't know what cracks.
But I also think, don't you agree that there is just something that may have rubbed the powers that be, as limited as they are in Yiddish literary history or Jewish literary historiography in general, the wrong way. The ways in which her work just goes against the grain of, what a woman should be writing about or what women characters should be doing, even professionally. Or the very ending of the story that you're going to be reading to us, the whole idea of not of the story, but of that section you're going to be reading to us, the whole idea that Muskuljudentum, that Jews shouldn't be powerful physically, that actually occurs. So and similar things for gender, similar things for class. She puts them all together.
She puts them all together. We think that only recently have we discovered the notion of what's called intersectionality. But there's always been multiple identities in every human being, and she's very good at pointing to those multiple commitments and identities. I think what you said earlier, these characters are not expected. Right. Also accounts for it. Right. A very good friend of mine read a couple of these, and when I asked her what she thought of it, she said, it wasn't at all what she expected. And I thought, that's exactly the point. Yes, exactly. I'm so glad you said that. Yeah. This is not what the myth of women's writing is, the Yiddish myth of women's writing is.
Which is not that different from the myth of women's writing in general, right?
She's frank about sexuality. She's even more frank about labor, about work. I don't mean giving, I mean work,
Yes.
right? That everybody needs a meaningful kind of work. And without it, nothing else matters. And I found that compelling. And also the marriages or the partnerships that come into this story are almost beside the point. That is, it's wonderful when they find each other or, when they compromise on something, but it always ends with, we're going off to work.
Yes. And the work needs to be meaningful.
And the work needs to be meaningful, which not everybody obviously can have, but there is certainly that striving for it.
Yeah. Well, that's wonderful. So that's probably one of the reasons that you chose to translate this, but and maybe the fact that you found, as you said, Max Weinrach's introduction, and you analyze it a little bit in your own introduction and point up how he's framing it in a way that already prevents us from seeing what's radical about it. But are there other reasons? I mean, it's a lot of work, as we know. Why did you choose this project? As you said, you hadn't intended to translate.
This is probably not something to be confessed quite so readily, but I started it because of historical consciousness. July 1939, Max Weinreich, Vilna. What can you avoid here? Right. And when I started reading, that's why I bothered to read the stories. And when I started reading the stories, I thought, like my friend, this is not what I was expecting. And that's intriguing. But I have to say, I didn't fall in love with the stories until after I had translated them. You know this from your own terrific translation work, that translating is a very different kind of enterprise than writing literary criticism, which is what we've done most of our careers, right? You get to understand or you get the illusion, at least, of understanding a book, a story, in a very different way, or at least that's been my experience. Yeah. And the nuances of language and the characterizations. And once I started reading, I was hooked, but it was really after, 9 iterations of this book, re-editing and editing, that I sort of felt like, oh, I love this. Yeah.
So what were some of the challenges of translating Chana Blankshteyn? Because, when I read her in Yiddish, and I've only read snippets of it in Yiddish here and there, and then the story that you sent me, it's a different kind of Yiddish prose.
So she started writing Yiddish late in her life. She was in her 60s, I think, if we have the right date of birth, when she started writing in Yiddish. And she wrote it, for political and social reasons as much as for aesthetic ones. She had something she wanted to say to the Jews. So on the one hand, that makes some of the translation actually easier, because she, one would think that she had a more limited vocabulary, which is not true. The challenges were, I said before, she was multilingual, at least 6 languages. Every once in a while,
some of them appear,
and some of them appear not as frequently as I was afraid, but some of them appear, and you have to figure out what to do with them. But as they're multilingual within the Yiddish, she'll throw in a Russian word or a Lithuanian word or a German word, French. So
they're not fused within Yiddish.
No. Was sagt die Fräulein? Yeah. Your topic, Chana, intertextuality, which, whatever I know I learned from you about that, is all over these works. Right, the first story that you mentioned, you can hear Kafka and Freud, I think, all over it. The second story is Midsummer Night's Dream in Yiddish.
Totally, yeah.
And
Cool, yeah.
you know, you can see hints of David Bergelson's style and of, she read all of these people, Marx and Freud and Babel and Kafka, and she knew their works. So one of the challenges is, how do you get that intertextuality in for an English reader, and also this multilingualism in for an English reader? There's also, like much modernist prose, she doesn't like quotation marks so much. And she changes point of view quite often. So, you know, figuring out how to make it clear that this is her talking and not him talking, or, you know, the omniscient narrator talking.
And I'm glad that you didn't do that all the time, that sometimes it's, you know, it's really part of the reading process that the narrator doesn't make it absolutely clear who's talking.
Yeah, that was the 8th iteration, I have to say. Because, you know, as a translator and as a scholar, I want everything to be clear. I want you to know everything.
Right.
But she didn't always. And so
this modernist experimentation, you know, in the style, in her style, where the topics are so much related to the historical context, from World War I to the rise of Nazism. I mean, there is a harrowing story that already, you know, shows the effects of that on Jewish characters.
Yeah.
So, you know, what is it about her prose style that you know, if you needed to say this is her signature, her handwriting, right? How would you characterize it? Because it's so distinct. Even, you know, and what's wonderful about your translation is that after reading a few stories, I think I could recognize a Chana Blankshteyn story when if I had seen one that you didn't translate, or that, you know, I hadn't read before. It's very, very clear.
If you do see one I haven't translated, let me know, because I thought they were all in that book.
Yeah.
I think I don't know that I can point to the characteristic. I do want, this is the one rehearsed thing that we did. I do want to read a little piece so that people get a sense of that language. I mean, she goes into the character. I mean, it's the character speaking rather than the narrator, and certainly rather than the author. And she varies. I found this both interesting and difficult. She varies sentence length. That is, many of these stories, many of these speeches, many of these characters who speak, and even the narrator who narrates, pull you up short at the end of a section or at the end of a story.
It's like a modernist rhythm, right?
Yeah.
I really want to hear that. You can read it both in English and in Yiddish, please.
We have time. Yes, we have time for that, right?
We have time.
Yes, you would think that after all this time of screen sharing and Zoom, there we go. Can you see this, Chana?
Yes.
Okay. So this stuff is just to position you. This is in what's actually the last story in the book, called Our Courtyard, which is where, you know, everything in Vilna is around courtyards. Much of Eastern Europe is around courtyards. This is where the narrator lives. The character we're about to hear is Paulina, who cleans houses in the courtyard. There's a young boy named Yoshke, whom we also have who also have references to. Dante, this is a Yiddish story. Dante is a portrait that Paulina takes down to dust, and we're going to see it again. And the narrator has been darning socks. Okay.
And she's by the window, right? She's
by the window, seeing everything. Yeah, that's right. Hab ihm schon eine Sach mal gesagt, soll reden a bissele stille. Entweder, als schreit gar nicht. Hat nur gute Lungen. Will ankommen in Sportclub, und ein Sportler muss haben gute Lungen. Dantes Maske hängt Schon, Dantes Maske hängt schon auf ihr Ort. Mit dem Stäubtichel in Hand dreht sich Pauline zu mir aus. Was ist das so ein Sportler? Ich erkläre. Körperliche Entwicklung, gymnastische Übungen. Wundert sie sich, wenig stark ist Joschke? Die Löcher in meine Socken sind verzerrt. Der Regen hat aufgehört und ich eile sich zu und will den Schmus verkürzen. Sportler ist ein Samin wie ein polnischer Sockel. Pauline ist überrascht. Jeden kennen euch sein Sockeln? Ich sehe, sie benimmt das nicht. Sie lässt herab den Kopf und schweigt. Und ich sehe, sie glaubt nicht. Nein, das kann nicht sein. Sie lebt 28 Jahre bei Jiden und in jüdischer Häuser, aber das legt sich bei ihr nicht auf den Sechel. Ich tue an den Hut und sehe im Spiegel ihr vertrachten Ponym. Ich schmeichel zu. Sie ist doch tagegerecht, die alte Pauline. A Jid wird kein Mal nicht werden, kein Sockel. Nein, das nicht. Stark wird Jid werden, nur dem Stolz von den Fäusten wird nicht haben. Nein, das nicht. I mean, the rhythm of this
Exactly.
is what's hard to, okay.
You did it though, you really did it.
This is Paulina speaking. I've told him many times to speak a little more quietly, and the answer is that he's not yelling, he just has good lungs. He wants to join a sports club, and a sportsman must have good, strong lungs. Dante's mask is back in its place. With the dust cloth in her hand, Paulina turns to me. What does it mean to be a sportsman? I explain. Developing the body, gymnastics, exercises. She wonders, isn't Yoshka strong? The holes in my socks are mended. The rain has stopped. I'm in a hurry and want to cut the conversation short. A sportsman is like a sokol, a member of the Polish Falcon Gymnastics Club. Pauline is amazed. Jews can also be sokols? And I see that she doesn't understand. She lowers her head and is silent, and I see she doesn't believe it. No, that can't be true. She's been living for 28 years among Jews, but this just doesn't make sense. I put on my hat and see her pensive face in the mirror. I smile. Actually, she's right, that old Paulina. A Jew will never become a falcon. No, not that. A Jew can become strong, but he won't be able to take pride in his fists. No, definitely not. So, I mean, here's a passage that shows some of the problems and some of the ways I, wormed my way out of it. Sokol is a Polish word for falcon. A Yiddish reader in Vilna would have understood what that meant. An English reader doesn't, but you can teach the English reader. I mean, I had to teach myself first by calling it not the gymnastics club, but the Polish Falcon Gymnastics Club. Yeah. So you get that, but also what's wonderful here is also the shifts, how quick and how meaningful they are, right? Isn't Yoshka strong? The holes in my socks are mended, right? I mean, this is how the world works. It doesn't work in necessarily logical, chronological order. And also the point of view changes, right? There's Paulina speaking. There's the narrator. This is the only first person narrative, by the way, in this book. And it's the only present tense story in the book. So it's a little unusual in that, but not in the other things. So the focalizer, the one through whose eyes we see things, is the narrator who is mending socks, except Pauline is the one who is speaking. And then there's this wonderful sentence that changes the focus entirely and yet fits in, right? I see she doesn't believe it. No, that can't be true. This is already Paulina's inner consciousness, right? She has been living for 28 years among Jews, but this just doesn't make sense. And Blankshteyn doesn't add to her, because that would alienate it a little bit from her. I mean, it would make it a narrative perspective rather than her perspective. Right. And there's a lot of that throughout here, quite beautifully. And then, of course, that repetition of not that, no, definitely not.
Mhm. And the political irony, right? Of, you know, Jews are not going to be like that.
Right.
They can't be like that. So I have a question. There is a companion story to this in Hebrew by a bilingual Hebrew Yiddish writer. Did she know any Hebrew? Dvorah Baron's courtyard story, Tel Aviv courtyard story, Ziva, is told from the point of view of a Yemenite house cleaner, joined with the perspective of an abused wife dog. It's an amazing story.
What year?
I didn't look it up, but I think it's definitely before. It's in the 30s, but definitely early 30s, probably. I don't know if it had not been translated at that time for sure.
I don't know. I don't have any evidence that she knew Hebrew. I mean, she was a member of Politzion.
Right.
Politzion.
And this story in particular has a Zion.
Yes, at the end, it's very clear. It's
Right.
the only one, but it's clear we're going to Zion. The only place to go is Zion. So I don't know if she would have known Dvorah Baron. I'm not surprised. I mean, it's fascinating. Okay, we must have some of our graduate students on here. Somebody needs to write this comparative essay about these two stories, right? Is there a feminist consciousness at work here? Is there, I mean, the courtyard is quite common in Yiddish and in Eastern European literature, but you know, what is woman's work? There's something, there's something to do here.
Absolutely. And the analogy between class, gender, and questions of violence. It's just,
it's
very
so
central in that.
It's so modern. I mean, the stories take place somewhere after the Russian Revolution and all of the, you know, turmoil in it, after the First World War, before the Second World War, although Hitler's already in power. And yet every page, I mean, I'm getting a little, you know, lyrical here, waxing a little too much. It just feels very modern, very contemporary is what I mean.
Yeah. So finally, I want to leave time for Q&A from our audience. Now that you have introduced her into the canon of Yiddish literature or of modernist Yiddish Jewish literature in general, where would she fit in? And
what do you mean, where would she fit? What do you mean, where would she fit
canon? I mean,
this is another one of my you know, pet themes, I'm afraid to say. So anybody who's heard me before has heard me say this at least twice.
That's why I'm asking.
Okay. So for the few who haven't heard this, it still doesn't make sense to me to talk about the canon in Yiddish literature. The canon, I mean, you know, the debates about the canon are legion and they exist in every literature. You know, does this belong? Does this not belong? How canonical is George Eliot? Well, in the 1880s, very in the 1920s, not so much. There's that debate, but in Yiddish literature, I think it's much more acute. There's so much there that hasn't been analyzed or taught or even read, right? I mean, the canon is what we teach and read. That's what the canon is. I mean, there aren't the kinds of institutional powers that despite a widespread journalistic history and great educational institutions, there aren't the kinds of institutional support for talking about a canon in a meaningful way. I mean, one of my favorite aphorisms, my own, is that there are hundreds of students who graduated the University of Michigan who believe that Yankiv Glatstein was a major American poet. And they're right. Because if you teach him in a course in Jewish American literature, he's a major American poet, which is what he is. So rather than, sort of separating them, where does she fit? She fits where all of the people whose works we've been translating in the last whatever number of years fit. Also, she read everything. She read, as I said before, she read her contemporaries in various languages. She read the classics in various languages. She fits in with them, in my opinion. But if I may, there's something that changed for me in the last couple of months. I'm teaching a course in the fall. I'm going to be teaching a course in the fall that I've taught before with great pleasure, and I like to think some success. It's a course called the Yiddish Classics in Modernity. And it's the big three, right? Abramovich, Shalom Aleichem, Peretz, a month on each, hello, goodbye. And after doing this research and doing this translation work, I realized that I didn't really know what I meant when I called them the classics. That is, I was following the accepted wisdom. We all call them the classicists. And so I added to the syllabus. It's an experiment. I put in translations, of which there are not enough, but I did some, and I found some of women who wrote at the same time. That is, who wrote between the 1860s and I stretched it to 1920, in 1917 when the last of them died, in order to ask questions about how our notion of modernity is I would say warped, I guess I should say skewed, to be polite, by focusing only on the male view of modernity or the male experience of modernity. What happens when we ask how women experience the modern and how they wrote about it? I don't actually know the answer to that yet. But I'm hoping, that collectively with all the work that we're doing, we'll be able to answer it at some point.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Alex, would you help us please field the questions?
Absolutely.
Welcome back. Mm-hmm.
So wonderful conversation. Thank you both so much. Just a reminder to everyone that if you have a question, please put that in the Q&A function. We'd love to hear from you. And we have a few questions to get us started already. First question from one viewer is, what for you were the challenges of translating for a 21st century English-speaking audience in particular? What did you want to give your contemporary readers? I know you touched on this a little bit with the question of translating from different languages, but I'm sure there are other aspects.
So this is always the translators, one of the many translators' dilemmas, right? Do you try to reproduce the English that would have been spoken at the time that the Yiddish was written? Or do you try to reproduce the English that is spoken today? And they're not entirely different, but there are some differences there. And I've become I don't know, it's not a principle, but it certainly is something that I've come to want to do, which also has to do with changes in translation theory over the decades, right? Translation is not a seamless activity. That is, I actually want readers to recognize that this is not American English of I don't even know what century I'm in, of 2022, right, or 2021. That this is another culture, and if you're going to have any understanding of that other culture, you can't assume that it's the same, that it's identical to yours. So that's a balancing act. I don't have a formula for that or anything, but it's a nice balancing act.
Let me piggyback a question on this one. How does that practice live side by side with your theory of translation, which you have expressed so brilliantly in a couple of books? But
it's the same. I mean, I first wrote about translation, right? The Writing in Tongues was about translation.
Right.
And I thought because I had read so much in translation. I've been so interested in how people were translating and variant translations of the same text. And I thought I'd try my hand at it, just, I wouldn't dare translate poetry. I know better than that. That's not what I do well, certainly. But what I learned in looking at the theory, a lot of the theory is obfuscation, things that make, that sound good, but don't really make sense. But one of the things that made very good sense to me was what I was trying to describe now, that give up this idea of one-to-one, not just, I don't mean grammatically or even in vocabulary, but the English reader has a different sensibility. I mean, I said I don't translate poetry, but Yiddish has a lot more tolerance for rhyme, for example. Iambic pentameter does not annoy the Yiddish reader in a way that it sometimes annoys the modern English reader. Similarly, expressions that change. I want understanding and empathy and sympathy to be based on an acknowledgement of difference, not on an erasure of it. I think that's a principle for me, if there is one.
Well put. Another audience member is asking if you know why Chana Blankshteyn turned to Yiddish only in her 60s, why not before? And apropos of that question, can you tell us anything about her writing in other languages?
I think she turned to Yiddish writing in her 60s in order to give us hope that it can be done at that age and at any age before and after. That's a little flippant, but she was so steeped in these other cultures and literatures that was her métier. But she really, I believe, she really wanted to reach the workers and the women of her environment, which was Vilna, the Vilna courtyards. And she became involved in the politics, as I said, the Volkspartei and then Polizien. If you want to convince, I mean, I'll start this a different way. We don't ask, well, maybe we do. Why did Abramovich turn to Yiddish? He wrote in Hebrew, very nice Hebrew. Well, not so nice, but he wrote in Hebrew. Why did he turn to Yiddish? Because he had something to say to the people that he was addressing, and he could only do it in Yiddish. And I think the same holds true for her.
Another viewer asks, we have learned about the male gaze in art history and photography. Do you think that there's a male and female gaze in Yiddish literature?
Okay. Yes, but that is, I can't, when I read, I guess the equivalent in literature is, well, the equivalent in literature is point of view, I think, right? What we call focalizer, through whose eyes are we seeing things? And there, you either believe that men and women sometimes, often see things differently, experience things differently, or you don't. At the same time, they are experiencing, men and women are experiencing the same historical moment, the same political pressures, the same sociological changes. They're experiencing a different educational system until the modern period, right? But what that meant in practice was that men who were educated traditionally, a loaded word in itself, men who were educated traditionally were educated in Talmud and Torah. Yeah? Women who were educated tended to be educated in foreign languages and not in Hebrew and Talmud and Torah, although there are exceptions to this everywhere, including Kaja Molodovsky, whom I mentioned earlier. So that the materials at their disposal and the modes of expression are often different. I
So
can't read, I can't read. This was an experiment we used to do, when I was in grad school. Somebody would give us, one of us, the graduate students, would give one another a paragraph and say, was this written by a man or a woman? There were all these essays called Writing as a Man, Reading as a Woman, Writing Like a Woman. And that is not an exercise that I personally found meaningful or conclusive. But the acknowledgement that there are differences, this is back to the theme of difference, I think is really important. But I cut off Chana. I didn't mean
no,
to.
I just wanted to add that from the perspective of modernist Yiddish poetry, I think it's really important to see how poets like Anna Margolin queer the whole dichotomy of male and female, and that's part of the modernist project transnationally. But it's to start your first and last collection of poetry with a poem that asserts "Ich bin gewesen einmal a Jüngling," right? Once I used to be a lad or a young man, and of course, look at all the translations. They're all, like, once I was young, just throwing it back to a cliched romanticism. And then the rest of the poem takes him on this, voyage through time and space to ancient Greece and Rome, and then she ends up with the Wilde Meises wegen Jeden and asserts the cost of gender bending and trying to fit into the kind of official history, which is a male history of Western Civ. So, I think there's a lot of that in Yiddish literature, and there's cultural, the stereotypes of the feminized Jewish male, et cetera, cultural reasons for it. But I think it's a really important question.
And even, this takes us away from Blankshteyn, but it's worth it. Even in that first line, "Ich bin gewesen einmal a Jüngling," Yingling doesn't actually mean boy. It's not a word. It's not a real word in Yiddish. You can say
it's a real word in German. And
it's a real word in German.
Stefan Georgi's circle, the male lovers who were young, in that Greco-Roman mold were called Jünglings.
I used to talk about that poem as a poem of transgression, right? The male, female, marrying her sister, homosexual, joining the Christians, not joining the Christians. And then I got nervous about that term transgression because it suggests a norm, which, like the canon, we should not assert.
Exactly.
So not so much transgression as another.
Yeah, beautiful poem. We had a question earlier, which you sort of addressed, but I want to bring it up because I think there's maybe more there to discuss about the critique or embrace of Zionism in the story that you read a little excerpt from. I wonder if you could speak a bit more about politics and how they're reflected in these stories.
Look, the Zionist theme is there only in this story, in this last story. And as I said, she was a member of Polet Zion, so her commitments, at least for the last, the Volkspartei ended in the early 30s, so she was a member of Polet Zion for not a very long time, but for till the end of her life. And it comes as every time I read that, I'm like, what? It comes as a surprise. All of a sudden, the boy's being sent off to join his uncle in Palestine to work the land that Jews have sweated over and bled for and are reclaiming. And it's both, kind of Deus ex machina, something comes out of nowhere and as a bolt. And it's a little anticlimactic, I have to say. It's not like the world ends with Zion, right? Historically, the movement is there, but it's like much else there, not not the point of this, not the whole point of the story. The story doesn't culminate in this, even if it ends in this, right? It culminates. It doesn't culminate. It is, what's important about it is this view of dozens of characters who live in the courtyard, all of whom are different from one another, who live together in some community, who work, who either help each other out or wonder about each other. I mean, it's really about the individuals, the characters, rather than some, yay, we've gotten to the end. This is where we've been leading all along. I mean, life doesn't work like that, and she certainly knew that.
Another question is, do you have a favorite story? If so, of these, from this book, and if so, why? Maybe you can tell us a little bit about it.
Nope.
Okay. That was easy.
No, what translator is going to tell you this is my favorite poem or this is my favorite story? Then what happens to the other 8 that are in here? There are only 9 stories here. I like different things about each of them. Now, sure. That said, I did change the order in which the stories appeared in the Yiddish, partly to catch the reader's attention, right? Her first story was not the story Fear, but I thought Fear really set up the mood of these stories, as well as that ending that Chana referred to of this life affirming. There's fear, yes, and it's dreadful, and it's Kafkaesque and all the rest, and there's a life affirming ending. The second story, which is the Midsummer Night's Dream takeoff, has I think a very ironic. I love that one. I mean, I love them all, but I love that one because at the end, the character who is a mathematician, right? I mean, this is not, this is already unexpected. The character who has been dreaming, as in Midsummer Night's Dream, and this was actually incredibly weird. I don't know these. I barely know these words in English, and they certainly never existed for me in Yiddish. But she's got satyrs and wood nymphs and cuirassiers and these mythological figures in there. And in the end, it's a short story. I'm not giving much away. And at the very end, the image in this woman's mind is of the queen of the wood nymphs hugging a jackass, like in Midsummer Night's Dream. And the ending is, I'm going to miss the exact words, but please don't saddle me with a jackass. I mean, this is right. I mean, don't saddle me with an ass. I don't even have the book in front of me, which is weird. So there's that kind of consciousness. But each of these stories has something else. I mean, I should say, they're not, they're unexpected for many, I think, because their focus is really on character and community, not so much on plot, and certainly not in a conclusive ending.
And apropos of the changed order of the stories, I just want to mention, for those that are curious to go read the Yiddish, the original title was simply Novellas.
Yes,
correct?
Sorry, that's right.
Yes, and we have a digitized copy actually that was digitized as part of our Vilna Collections project. I dropped the link in there.
Excuse me, it was initially digitized because I wanted to translate it, and I didn't have a copy that I could either take out or so.
So brought to you thanks to Anita Norich.
No. It's brought to you thanks to the Vilna collection. It's brought to you thanks to the Vilna collection, but I was very grateful for its digitizing.
I'm glad that we were able to help.
Oh, one more.
Yes.
So I can't stop talking about this. I said there were 2 copies of this book in the United States. And when Chana asked about publication history, the obvious question is, July 1939, how does a book get from Vilna to New York? Right. And it gets from Vilna to New York because Dina Abramovich's parents sent it. It's Dina Abramovich, the legendary librarian of the YIVO Institute, who had the library in her head for 50 years and more. So she was caught in the war. Her father, Hersh Abramovich, was out of the country. And the copy that YIVO has is signed by him, Amatone Hirsch Abramovich. Did he carry it with him? Was it sent to him? The one that is at the Yiddish Book Center, which was actually sent to the book center from St. Louis. St. Louis. What's it doing in St. Louis? Dina Abramovich's mother sent it to someone who was a Jew, the Yiddish reader in St. Louis. And the community sent it on to the Yiddish Book Center. I mean, this is the history of the Yiddish book.
Thank you, Dina Abramovich and her family.
Amen.
Amazing.
Thank you, Dina Abramovich, for very many things.
Absolutely.
I see there's a question by Jordan, who is a fellow translator of.
I can't see the questions for some reason.
Let me read it out loud.
Please.
A question, this is Jordan asking, a question I've been chewing on is the clash between the fact that these women were writing and getting published, not irregularly in the press, but not so often in book form. They were clearly being read and thought about. So it's not accounted for in these stories and serialized novels' literariness. Men, of course, were publishing in book form what they had published first in the very same newspapers and journals. Is what accounts for this more than the obvious? And do we know anything about Blankshteyn's publisher and how this book specifically came to be?
Okay, these are great questions. And I think, Jordan, the answer is the obvious one you gave. Publishing a book takes money. And either it takes a press, very few presses run by women or particularly sensitive to the need for women's publications. And a number of the ones that I've been working on, actually, I think it's fair to say that certainly there was, preconceptions about what women ought to be writing and how it ought to be disseminated. But the war interrupted is a huge understatement, but it made this work seem less significant at the time and then lost. What was the question about this particular book? How it came into being.
Yes. Okay,
so this is a sad story. It had, as I said, the stories were published in the Vilna press. She was dying, probably of cancer, in her maybe 80s, late 70s. And a group of friends, that's what the Yiddish book says, a group of friends put it together in her honor. And I think, so it was done privately, as was a lot of Yiddish publication. But to publish privately, again, in Vilna in July of 39, says something. And that's, and then it had that little Max Weinreich intro.
Fascinating. We're just about out of time, but there's a kind of logistic question. Are you teaching your class at YIVO in the fall? And if so, is it available virtually? I know we haven't announced the classes yet, but I know that there is an answer to this. So
I don't know that there is an answer to this.
Oh, there's not. Okay, so stay tuned.
But I'm grateful to the question. I'm teaching actually starting next week, attached to the Ziva program, to the summer program, 3 hour an hour a week, 3-session thing on translation. But stay tuned.
Stay tuned, everyone. Well, we're really glad to have you for the summer program. And I'm going to put the link to purchase this book once again in the chat. We urge you all, go check it out, read it, get the Yiddish original from YIVO and compare your notes.
Please do.
Anita, sorry,
No, I just want to say, depending on when you buy the, I mean, it's also on Kindle, but if you buy the hardcover, I mean, not the hardcover, nobody should ever buy the hardcover, which is obscenely expensive as opposed to just very expensive. But some of the paperbacks have at the end, this is a huge embarrassment to me. At the end, they have a page that says about the author, you know, the last page about the author. And some of them, when they first were issued, they had my biography instead of Chana Blankshteyn's. And I thought, here's a Dibuk who's gotten into this text. I've been trying to make her come back to life, and they erase her. They promised that they would take it out. So if you get that, erase the word author and put in the word translator, please.
Sounds good. Anita, Chana, thank you both so much. This has been a wonderful conversation.